I love it. The fans were clicking. Started to set off my ADHD because that's all I hear. And if it seems that I paused and hesitated just a moment there, I truly did because I was trying to not pay attention to the clicking. And if you've ever done that, if you've ever tried to not pay attention to something, what happens?
You pay attention.
All the more. And so over the years, I put a few people in place that, hey, if you hear this clicking, no, it's going to drive me crazy, and fix it. And they did. So thank you to those of you who took care of that. I truly, truly appreciate it because it is rough and difficult to pay attention when we're distracted. It's very hard to learn something and to grow or to teach something whenever there are things going on that are challenging us or fighting for our concentration. In fact, they're still clicking. So if somebody can get it, keep going. They're still clicking, turn them off something. Otherwise, I won't be able to do it. I love the fact that as a church we can be totally honest and transparent with one another. And it's something that I think we need to do more and more of. And we're working on this series. We've been talking about crossing the line. And today is part 4, and we're almost to the end. But it's really about reaching out. It's really about evangelism. It's really about helping people know who Christ is and crossing that line from not being a Christian to becoming a Christian. And I've learned over the years that the moment you talk to people about evangelism, or the moment you talk to people about sharing the gospel, they tend to shut down. And we all get this blank look in our eyes, and perhaps a blank expression on our face, and everybody gets terrified. It's been my experience prior to ministry. It's been my experience on this side being in ministry that when I talk to people about this, they really get nervous. And so I thought today, you know what? We're going to open with a couple jokes. So this is for all of you who get nervous whenever you hear the word evangelism and you freeze. One of my favorite ones, it's a story that I've heard a number of times. It's actually from Billy Graham. It's a story that he shared, something that happened to him. He went to a small town to preach, and this was long in the days before email, long before cell phones or texting or anything along that line. And so he went to this small town, and he had some letters that he wanted to mail. And so as he was walking through town, he asked a young boy, "Can you tell me where the post office is so that I can mail some letters?" The young boy gave him directions, and Billy Graham said, "Well, I would like to return the favor, and if you're willing to come to church tonight, I will tell you how to get to heaven." The boy paused for a moment, and he said, "I don't think so, mister. You don't know where the post office is." I can appreciate that. I like that one. The other one that I want you to think about, and this might hit just a little closer to home, it was about a guy who prayed the same prayer every morning. He would wake up in the morning and say, "Dear God, if you want me to witness to someone today," and I know that you do, "if you want me to witness to someone today, please give me a sign to show me who it is." Well, one day after praying that prayer for quite some time, he found himself on a bus, and this bus was rather empty, and at a particular stop, a big burly man got onto the bus, and wouldn't you know, he sat down right beside him. The bus is almost completely empty, and this guy sits down beside him. And before he could get too nervous about this big burly man sitting next to him, the guy just begins to break down. He starts crying. He says, "I'm a sinner, and I'm afraid that I'm going to go to hell. I don't know who Jesus is. Is there somebody on this bus who could help me with knowing who Jesus is?" The man at that point bowed his head and said, "Dear God, is this the sign?" Oh, it's okay to laugh. It's okay to relax a little bit. And I have our text illustration this morning is from the Gospel of John chapter 9, if you have your Bibles. We're actually going to look at someone who experienced and was able to tell people about Jesus, but you may not think about it as evangelism. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of John chapter 9. And as you're turning there, I want you to think, part of the reason that we cringe whenever it comes to evangelism, I think are two main reasons. Number one, we all have the image of the somewhat crazy person who stands on the corner yelling, "You're going to hell, come know Jesus." And we sure don't want to be that person. At least most of us don't. And the second is, if we're totally honest, even though maybe we've been Christians for a long time, we feel completely unprepared to tell someone what it means to accept Jesus. We feel like we don't know enough answers, or they might ask us a question and we're not going to be able to provide them an answer, or they're going to look at us funny because we've started to share, maybe we couldn't explain it as well as we think we should be able to. And so we're afraid it's going to make us look crazy, or we're afraid that we don't know what we're doing. There's a lot of reasons for fear, but I think those are two that sum it up pretty well. As you finish turning to John chapter 9, I want you to go back to the past couple of weeks. We learned a couple things that really set the groundwork for this. The first is that God chooses to work through humanity. God doesn't have to, but God chooses to work through us. It's throughout the scriptures. We looked at Isaiah chapter 6, but it's throughout the scriptures of God choosing to work with humanity. The second, as we went a step further, is that we understood that everyone has value. Every living person has value, and beyond that, every person matters to God. Implied in that is that every person should matter to us. And then last week, we looked at the Good Samaritan, and there were 3 traits in there that are absolutely essential if we're going to do evangelism well, if we're going to talk to people to Jesus in a way that I think they're going to want to hear it. The first is we need to be authentic. So I'm not asking you to do anything that is fake or put on or learn script or anything along that line. Be who you are. Be authentic with people. It's one of the best testimonies that you have. It's one of the things that I love about Cornerstone. Be who you are. It's not an excuse to be lazy. It's not an excuse to be sinful. It's not an excuse to never grow or to never work. But be who you are. Be the person that God has created you to be. The second one is to be compassionate. Show people that you care. It absolutely matters. In fact, the compassion in the young church as it formed in the first couple centuries was one of the things that blew non-Christians away. They couldn't believe that people cared so much about one another and about people that they hadn't even met or necessarily liked. So compassion is huge. And then the third part that we looked at last week is be willing to sacrifice. Be willing to take that risk. And all of those things, they lead up today. They're really the building blocks of what we need for today to do this well. And so it's John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. As Jesus went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it in the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam," where this means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. He replied, "This man they call Jesus made some mud and put it in my eyes. He told me to go to the pool and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. You're going to look at this and say, well, how is that evangelism? How is that reaching out? Because when we think of evangelism, we tend to think of what the Apostle Paul did. Of going into a town and laying out a long argument and knowing all of the correct theological terms and understandings and being able to persuade someone to see things our way. How is this evangelism? Because what we understand as an evangelist is someone like the Apostle Paul. How is this blind man, one who used to beg, really doing evangelism? Well, first of all, this is an amazing passage because it addresses one of the things in the world that we really struggle with. Suffering. With life not being fair or right or always going the way it should be. And there was this understanding in Jesus' day, and I even think at times it still continues, that if a child was born with some sort of birth defect, some sort of problem, then it was a result of sin. And so what you have the disciples saying here to Jesus is, okay, who sinned? Why was this person born blind? Was it his parents' fault? Was it his fault? Had he sinned at some point in the womb and he had done something along this line? And we don't talk much about this, But this was such a common take on it, that any kind of problem was the result of sin. Now, sin does bring consequences with it. We know that today. We still believe that today, but not in this realm. Jesus gives this amazing, guilt-free answer to anyone who was around. To whether it was the parent of a child born blind or to the man who was born blind himself, it wasn't the result of sin. No one is Jesus' answer. No one caused this. And Jesus kind of accepts it as something that happens. But he doesn't just go on his way. He says, but let me tell you something amazing. God is going to do something great through what you thought was sin. Through what you thought was a problem, God is able to do something amazing and change this man's life. I was thinking about children being born with birth defects and this idea of sin causing it. It's a story that I don't actually share very often, but when I was 2, I had a sister who was born who was only partly formed. And so she lived just a matter of hours and passed into eternity. It was a very difficult time. My parents tell me that even I struggled very much with it, but the whole family did. There was so much guilt and suffering and even shame that is attached to this whenever there is a problem in our life. And I love that Jesus just doesn't skirt the issue. Jesus just doesn't ignore it. He addresses it and says, this is something that happens. It's not the result of sin. But God can do amazing things even in this situation. What a great source of comfort to the man right there. That might have been a bit of healing for the man in that moment already, because for these years he had struggled with being blind, with not being able to see. And if you read the rest of the passage, what was his occupation?
Begging.
Begging. That was his occupation. There was no welfare check. There was no social security check. There was no one who was going to take care of him. You didn't have food banks in the way that we do now. The way that he survived was by begging. There was no one else who was going to take care of him. If strangers didn't put money in his cup, he wouldn't eat. If they didn't give him what he needed, he wouldn't have the necessities that he needed. And so his occupation was begging. Think about that, because our attitude towards those who beg is not much different than the attitudes of Jesus' day. We do not say, boy, when I grow up, I hope to be begging for what I need. No, we want to earn our keep, to take care of ourselves. And so there is a lot of shame that this man has carried all of his life. Not only for the disability that he has, but the way that he meets his needs. And so for Jesus, who is teacher, rabbi, Messiah, as we know him now, to stop and address this man, he is already saying to this man, you are important. You matter to God. You have value. To be totally honest, I have pretended not to see people when they were begging on the side of the road. Bet I'm not the only person in the room. We don't like things that make us uncomfortable. And this is one that takes us outside of our comfort zone. And Jesus stops and addresses this man. And then he does something that he never imagined. He mixes the spit and the dirt. And you get mud. You have to wonder if the blind man thought, what is he doing? I always love to put myself in the scriptures and to identify with the people around Jesus, whether they are in a positive role or a not so positive role, because we can identify with all aspects of life. But it sounds a little crazy, because up until this moment, you just didn't do that. You just didn't mix spit and dirt and put it in somebody's eye and say, go wash in the pool. We would sit and say, wow, this is Jesus. I'm going to be healed. I'll have my sight. It's amazing. This is the first time. And so there had to be a little bit of question in this man's mind. What is Jesus doing? And is this really going to work? Or how am I going to get to the pool? Or great, now I've got spit in my eye. Whatever it might be. Whatever it might be. Jesus mixes the mud, puts it over the man's eye, and then he gives him this command, go to this pool and wash. We know the story. He can see. He comes home seeing, and it changes not only his day and life, but it impacts everyone around him. Now this is the part where it really turns into evangelism. Twofold. Number one, Jesus told him to do it, and he did it. He didn't have to. He absolutely did not have to. We don't have this idea of Jesus dragging him to the pool and saying, get under there. He goes on his own because Jesus told him. So he believed. And then when he comes back and he can see, others are arguing, is this the man? I don't know. I'm not used to seeing him stand up. I'm used to seeing him on the side of the road begging. If he was in that position, I'd recognize him. But he's different. Something has changed in him, and I don't recognize this man the way I always have. And so they're arguing, is it him? Is it him? And I kind of get the picture. It's almost like the high school dance off to the side whispering. And whispering loud enough that everyone can hear, because the man hears, and he says, it absolutely was me. I am the man who was blind and begging. Boy, talk about owning your situation. About being able to stand up and say, yes, this is where I was. And to know that if you stand up and say, this is me, there's going to be more questions that follow. He could have faded into the crowd. He could have chose to hide or to not come back the same way or to disappear because now he can see he can go anywhere he wants to go. And yet he comes back, and when the group sees him and they have these questions, is it him, is it not him? He says, absolutely, it was me. I am the man who was the beggar. I am the man who was blind from birth. I am the man who Jesus put spit and dirt together and rubbed it into my eyes, and now I can see. It caught them off guard. No one was expecting that. Absolutely no one thought that that's the way that this was going to go. And yet that's the story that John tells us. It's the gospel that is passed down. And so it's this amazing moment where this man, who up until this moment, his entire career was begging, becomes an evangelist. Not because he had training, not because he knew the sound apologetics, but because of his experience and his encounter with Jesus. I was blind, but now I see. Now we know that from the tune Amazing Grace, right? We know that song, we love that song. This is where it comes from. I was blind, but now I see. And in this instance, it is a literal blindness and literal seeing. It's the physical sense. But we also know that it applies in the spiritual sense as well. That there was a day where we were blind to Jesus. There was a day where we did not understand the spiritual realm, where we did not understand that Jesus loved us, that Jesus died for us. And there came a day when that changed. And we went from being spiritually blind to being able to see spiritually. It's this amazing story in the gospel of an evangelist who didn't go to seminary. Of an evangelist who wouldn't go on to preach a sermon. It's the story of a man who was transformed by Jesus. Best evangelism model out there. Because if you are sitting there and saying, well, at one point, yeah, I did have that conversation where I asked Jesus into my life. And I remember a day when I didn't know him, and now I do. Guess what? Jesus changed you in some way. If you're sitting there saying, I can't think of how I've been changed, well, then we need to have one of two conversations. I love application. And if we're talking about evangelism, guess where the application is going? What's your story? What is your encounter with Jesus? What was the moment in which Jesus came into your life where you were blind and he saved you and you began to see? Because I will guarantee that the person you are today is different than you were that day. Some of us don't know our story because we've never stopped to write it. We've never stopped to think about it or to put words into it. Or we're scared of what someone may say. I guarantee for the man it was not easy to say it was me. Because when he stood up and said it was me, he was also identifying himself as that beggar who had been there for years. But his joy washed away any shame. And so where do we go from here? Where do we go with this story? What do we do with it? Because as I often tell you on Sundays, if the point was to come and to hear a sermon and to learn something and to just go home until next Sunday, then I kind of didn't hit the target. The point is to take what we learn as we read the scriptures and to apply it into our life so that we do something with it. It's not just to be people who know a lot of stuff about the Bible. It's to be people who actually live the scriptures out. Sitting there saying, so what do we have to do? Well, I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to make you go out and stand on street corners and evangelize. You're welcome. You do not have to do that. But I'm also encouraging you to be more aware than the guy on the bus at the beginning. Sometimes we have people around us who are screaming out and crying and say, somebody please tell me about Jesus. And we sit there and say, boy, God, I don't think you could use me. You better send somebody better. Or you better send somebody who really knows and understands. I'm asking you to be aware. I'm asking you to see not just physically, but spiritually, the people around you. And that is kind of scary because we don't know where it might lead. You might have the opportunity to tell someone about Jesus this week. Some of you are saying, oh yeah. Some are saying, oh no. They're both real responses. They're both real responses. But here's the part that I want you to walk away from in this. If you've accepted Jesus, you already have a story to tell. The question is, are you willing to tell it? I can't script it for you. I can't write it for you. If you need help putting it together, I will gladly sit down and help you with that. Or some other people around you are sitting there saying, I love to tell people about Jesus. They'll help you with that. Because it is awesome to tell people what God has done in our life. And I really don't want you to miss it. I don't want you to miss that joy, to miss that opportunity. Not all evangelists are like Billy Graham. Not all evangelists are like the Apostle Paul. Many are like the blind man who Jesus gave back his sight. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we just thank you for today. We thank you for this time together in this story in John's Gospel about a blind man. Oh God, we have all been blind. We have all failed to see you and failed to see those around us. God, open our eyes. God, if we actually need mud and spit in our eyes, put it there and help us to see what it is that you're doing. God, help us to remember that all people have value and that all matter to you. God, give us the courage to be who we are. Give us the willingness to be compassionate to those around us. And God, if we need to sacrifice some pride, or sacrifice some time, or sacrifice anything else so that we might share your gospel, God, help us to do it. God, I pray for each person here, each person who knows you, and maybe those who are on the fence who haven't quite made that decision. God, I just pray that it would be something that is the first and best thing in our life. Knowing how much you love us. And God, we pray for each and every person who we come in contact with this week. God, may we be ready to share, and may they be ready to hear. God, thank you that you can use each one of us on a daily basis. Thank you for loving us and being with us the way you are each and every day.